Welcome to the Free Cities podcast. My name is Timothy Allen, and this is the official podcast of the Free Cities Foundation. Hello, and a warm welcome to episode number 14 of the Free Cities podcast. This is part 3 of our series of conversations recorded in Prague, and today I am talking to Jan Mošovský. Jan is the Director of Research at the Liberalni Institute, which is a Czech think tank championing the ideas of classical liberalism. He is also the European Programmes Manager at Students for Liberty, which many of you will know is the largest libertarian students organisation in the world. I begin our conversation by asking Jan about something he wrote in an article, which was, "Every good story is ultimately libertarian in nature." Now, I found that to be a very interesting observation, and it leads us into an in-depth discussion on libertarianism, liberalism, and governance models. Jan has reservations about the viability of the Free Cities model, and we discuss where he sees vulnerabilities, as well as offering potential alternatives. Now, when I listen back to our conversation, I feel it would probably be a good idea to add a small addendum to my side of the dialogue at the point at which we were discussing the possibility of the state coming into a free city and shutting it down. Since our conversation, I have got further clarification from Prospera about the legal treaties in place to mitigate this. There are in fact two, the first being the Central American Dominican Republic Free Trade Agreement, in which the US is a signatory. Within this treaty is a key clause that guarantees that the property of foreign investors will not be expropriated by another country. This of course affects Prospera since it has several US investors. So if the government changed its policy, this would obviously violate the treaty. The second treaty is the Honduras Kuwait Treaty, in which there are similar clauses that would impact investments made by Kuwaiti nationals. Anyway, I'm glad to have cleared that up, and now it just leaves for me to say to you, many thanks for listening. I really do hope you are enjoying these conversations, and if you feel like it, please leave us a review on your podcasting app, and I will thank you in advance. And in the meantime, just sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Jan Mošovský. Do you know, here's how I want to start, Jan, because this is a trouble I've had with a lot of the Czech people we've been meeting here, is whenever I Google you, 99% of the results are Czech, and it's very difficult to sort of like research Czech people. But I did find some stuff you'd written online. Do you remember writing something about Dune, the film?
Yeah, I do.
Right, okay. That got my imagination going, right? Not that I've even seen Dune or read the book or anything, but there was just one of the first things you wrote in there is every good story is libertarian in nature. I like that. Never thought of it like that before. Can you expand a little bit on that? Like, what do you mean by that?
Of course. Well, I think every good story has a hero, and a hero is an individual. So I would say that every good story is in its nature individualistic, and that I consider libertarian regardless of what the ultimate message of the story is.
So, I mean, does that mean then that every good story is the story of the innate struggle of individuals against, I suppose, powers or authoritarians, or what would you call it?
I'd say it's definitely a story of struggle against some obstacles, and this might be an objectivist take, but I would say that there doesn't necessarily need to be an opponent. It could be a struggle to be good, to do well, And that in itself, I would say, speaks to the core libertarian values, right? We are not ultimately fighting against something. We want to have the freedom to do great things.
Right. But probably, I mean, I'm thinking about most stories I can think of. It's not a very good way to look at it because I'm probably missing half of them. But it's normally a behemoth of, like, you know, Star Wars, let's say. You know, there's the Death Star.
Yeah, there's the bad
I mean,
guy.
you mentioned in the article, actually, that science fiction really does accentuate this storyline. But what I was wondering is, at the core of it, are you thinking about the state versus the individual? Is that the big story? You know, is that the narrative?
I actually don't think so. I think, and I try to separate positive libertarianism or liberalism from negative one, and I think we ultimately shouldn't be against something. We should be for something, and that should be the possibility to do what we want, to develop in the way we see our life going, to do the activities that we want to engage in, and I would say that's not necessarily being against something. Ideally, there would be nothing to be against, but specifically in science fiction, there usually is the bad guy, the Death Star, or the villain, and that definitely puts this in much clearer colors. But I think this doesn't necessarily tie only to science fiction, and this might be my subjective view on novels in general, but one of my favorite authors is Steinbeck, and there usually isn't a villain in the book. It's just people going through life, but they are very clear-cut characters who are trying to achieve something, build a life, and I would consider them libertarian or heroes representing some of the core values to libertarianism without there being a villain.
Right, that's interesting. So the hero is not always battling an evil force. The evil force necessarily, though, when they are battling an evil force, it's normally it's a power struggle. It's an authority trying to impose something on you. That's kind of like, so we're talking about a core. Is this an eternal struggle? Like, you know, the thing about a lot of people when they think, okay, you know, the world would be so good if we could all just live like this, you know, live and let live, or whatever your core values might be. But my obvious observation is nothing's static. There's no such thing as the happy ending. Even in the stories, there's normally a happy ending, but we know that's not true. That's a new beginning. So is this an eternal struggle, do you think?
I think, yeah, I would say that it is. And talking about the books, the good is usually the given, right? Because we need to identify with the main characters, with the heroes. So for us to do that, they need to be good. We aren't likely to identify with the bad guys usually. Hopefully. So then when you need to paint the main character as good, that creates the necessity of evil being there to create the contrast. So, mind
you, do you ever see a film called Broken? Have you ever heard? Do you remember this film?
I don't think I have.
Broken. It's a film about. It's a very interesting film. Actually, it's a film about a guy who realizes he's a superhero. He doesn't know it. And he realizes it because he's in a train crash. And
I've seen that film. I now remember.
Well, the protagonists in that film are both good and evil, aren't they? And that's part of the narrative of the film, is that he realizes that the guy that plays the guy with the cane, you know, a very famous American actor. He's a baddie. I mean, he's the guy making all the accidents happen. But the point of the film is that you can't have one without the other. I suppose I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's kind of, you know, it's not always that you identify with maybe the goodie, I suppose.
It might not be, and I think since you mentioned Dune before, I think that.
Well, but you better explain Dune to me, because I don't know anything about it. I've never read it, and I've never seen it. So just apart from I remember the book cover. It's good. And aren't there giant worms in it as well? Something
there are.
Yeah, that bit it didn't entice me, except though the fact that in Mongolia, a country where I go to a lot, there is a myth about a sandworm that eats people. I just wondered whether they got it from there. Do you know about that?
I think it might be based on that.
The death worm from
Yes.
Mongolia. Right.
Yeah,
That's a real myth.
The book actually has something that's interesting from today's perspective. It focuses very much on environmental topics, and it paints out the planet's ecosystem to a large degree, and the story is dependent on that. But the main plot line of the first book is a struggle of a less influential family against the empire and against the united power of both the major state-controlled corporations and the superstate, the empire as well. So in that sense, it might be similar to Star Wars, but it actually goes much more in depth. But I would say that this is only the first layer of the story, and this is where it ties to what we were talking about before, is that I would say ultimately it's a story about the hero trying to, as he gains power, trying to prevent himself from becoming the villain he initially rebelled against. And ultimately what we identified, because I think this is something that we all sometimes question, whether we are doing good actions, to what degree are we actually good people. So this is what I think we identify with in Dune.
Just out of interest, in the book or the film, how are the governance models structured? Because I've talked to people in the past on this podcast about, what would a governance model in space be like? And interestingly, the answer was it would have to be extremely authoritarian, because in space, you can't just open the door by accident because everyone dies. There would have to be very strict top-down rules about how to live. It's not, I don't know. I wonder what Dune, it's on planets, is it? It's not. You're right. Okay. Mm-hmm. Does it talk much about the governance models?
It does, and the government model changes throughout the book as different factions gain power. But ultimately, it's a three-poled structure. When there is and it's based very much on medieval Europe. So there are houses that govern the individual planets, and there is the empire who rules over them. And the idea is that together the houses outweigh the power of the empire.
Well, by houses, do you mean not just a house?
Noble houses?
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, okay, like a castle or something.
Exactly, like ruling the planets or multiple planets at the time. And then there is the empire ruling over it all. And at the same time, there is struggle around resources going on. So there is research produced on Dune, which is why the book is centered around it, that allows interstellar travel. So the corporation or the super corporation controlling the resource and the travel itself is the third pole of the power structure.
So, and more powerful than what's the moral of the story, or what's it trying to teach us about power structures? Because currently we see the version of that on planet Earth. Isn't that true to say? We have ruling. In the sense that the corporate side of life is obviously the powerful side. Mm-hmm. It's even if it's not obvious, it's doing it out loud. It's dictating much of what goes on. Mm-hmm. So, what was the in the film? What's it trying to show us, if anything? Maybe it's just a fun story. Who knows?
It might be. There is a line actually in the book that literally says that the three-pole power structure is the most unstable one, and that's the initial crisis of the book and then the film.
Sorry,
where
the three-pole
structure,
right? As in
the
kings, or the ruling class, the corporate,
and what you might consider the middle class through the noble houses in the book.
It says it's the most unstable.
Most unstable, because the initial setup of the book and the film is that two of the points of the structure, the corporation and the empire, unite against one of the houses where the main hero is, and that creates the initial crisis.
And do they postulate what the most stable? Not that I'm saying unstable is bad, but do they postulate what should happen, or what the stable version is?
They don't really. The book eventually, I would say, as the series continues, there is sort of like is increasingly pessimistic as the power structure becomes a very centralized empire with just one center of power. But then as the series progresses, I would say that the model becomes more optimistic, maybe more liberal, as ultimately what defeats the empire in somewhere in book 6, where few people get is decentralization and just growth. Eventually, just growth and wealth destroys the power structure as people expand through space and become no longer controllable, which might be a good model for us as well.
Yeah, I mean, is that what happened in Rome? Is that how Rome spread itself too thin and then fell under its own weight? Or do you mean they just explored space and just the state became irrelevant because they were so far away?
Yeah, that's more what happened. I wouldn't say that necessarily was what happened with Rome.
Go on then, tell me.
I'm not a historian in no way, but my understanding is, first of all, that it became too vulnerable to outside invaders, and that it, to a large degree, depended on conquest for resources, and eventually you run out of power to conquer new resource-rich provinces.
Yesterday in Parallelni Polis, I was talking with Martin about this, and he said that it was the Christian uprising that caused the demise, that began a very small thing. He was obviously linking it to the what's happening in their art collective. Is like when you have a system, something from inside begins very small. In his example, in the Christians had to practice Christianity in the catacombs. They were the rebels of their time. And as it grew larger and larger and larger from within, it caused the collapse of the Roman Empire. I'd never heard that before. Maybe it's true. I always assumed that as they spread themselves thinner and thinner and thinner at the edges, because the Roman Empire made it to where I live in Wales, just about, and they were fought off there because it was literally impossible to bring enough soldiers out that far to beat the decentralized armies that were just everywhere. And I've always assumed that's the life cycle of a centralized authority. Am I wrong?
Yeah, it very well might be. Not sure if that's how the life cycle might unfold today still, but
why not? Why do you think that couldn't happen? Is that an issue of technology?
I would say yes. I would say technology and the infrastructure we have in place just doesn't really allow us to go somewhere and disappear.
Right, unless it's off planet, of course.
Of course.
Which is exactly what happened in Dune. Well, come on, let's go a bit further into that then. So, that's a pretty... that's not a very optimistic view of the future then. Are we trapped on the planet in this horrible system of authority then?
Well, first of all, I'm optimistic in the interpretation. Especially where we are sitting now, I don't think we are trapped. I would say we are much closer to the libertarian ideal than the collectivist ideal. We are still in a market economy. We can do mostly what we want. But in the sense whether we have somewhere to go to escape, I would say that the options are limited geographically in the sense that we don't have the Paradise Island or the Galt's Gulch to disappear to, but at the same time we have places to disappear to without moving. So I would say that technology today and increasingly allows us to disappear in the virtual world, to do our things sort of off track and disappear without moving, which might be a preferable alternative.
Obviously, the Free Cities model would probably come up against that theory that there are no places left to go. What's your take on that then? Is that a flaw in the model?
I don't think it is. I think it's definitely one of the avenues that needs to be explored, and I think this might be the right time to explore it. However, I am not sure how lasting it is, especially as there seems to be a united front amongst the progressive and the conservatives on combating tax havens and these places of refuge, because whether it is socialistic reasons against wealthy people, or whether it is nationalistic reasons about taxing everybody at home or country of origin. This is something that they seem to be united on.
It's easy to get people behind that notion as well. It's like, these guys don't want to pay taxes.
Yeah.
It's like, we're all in prison. These guys want to leave the prison.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, get them, bring them back. Yeah.
So I would say, as private cities gain popularity, the opposition will get stronger, and instead of dividing and conquering, the countries or the states will just unite and overregulate. Because, but
hold a minute. Okay, let's think about that. Can states, do they work in cooperation that much? Like, look at the moment. Say, is Honduras, the government of Honduras, going to decide with, I don't know, another country that I know, let's come down hard, or is this something that just happens individually? I'll give you an example, because I only discovered this yesterday, right, whilst talking to someone else, that one of their ideas about free cities was, one of my problems with it is that what happens when the state comes in to shut it down, and as it turns out, there is a place, Prospera, Prospera in Honduras, okay? And apparently part of the legal framework of Prospera, which was, when it was set in stone, means that it's an international treaty. So if anyone goes against, if the socialist government in Honduras decides, right, we're going to renegade on our contract with this city, apparently, this is what Peter from the Free Cities Organization told me, the American government have a legal right to come in and whatever, I'm not sure, confiscate, whatever. But they have this kind of agreement. So unless America and Honduras come together and go, but then you've got the whole American legal system, which is also deciding, this, that, and the other. So are you confident that states can come together and decide to do this?
I'm definitely not, and I'm happy that I'm not. But so this is also why I say that this might be the time for these projects. But I would say that as they become more successful, the incentive to do that will increase. Yes. So one way we would like to interpret it will be that as these states become, or the private cities become more successful, that might, and they become an actual competition in taxation and in other respects, quality of living, to the nation states, then that would put them under competitive pressure that they are not currently under, and that would force them to improve some of the parts. But I would be pessimistic that that's how they would react.
Okay. In the state would not get competitive. Yeah,
I think it would opt to regulate or limit trade and capital movement instead.
But all right, on the other side of that coin is the fact that they are deriving, resource wealth from the free city. So I know that states don't make logical decisions. We know that in many cases, but the incentive to over-regulate something that's giving you an income is not obvious. I mean, I think the main problem I can see is an ideological one. Like in Honduras, for example, the ZAs, the zones of economic employment, etc. They were set up during a sort of slightly right-wing government. So now the left-wing government are in. They're vilifying them not necessarily because they're right or wrong, but because they were the other guys that did it. So we need to sort of like push back against that. I think that's probably there. But you think that they will see them as a threat at some point and then say, right, in order for them to not oust us, we need to regulate them?
I think that might be the case. Or, as you said, at some point the government might decide, well, there are all these resources, and there will be more of them for us if we just seize them.
Seize them. Yeah. Okay. Well, and that goes back to my point originally that I discovered yesterday, that could then become an international issue, because I think I didn't go into it deeply, but it's something along the lines of, in Honduras, the property rights extend to corporations in America. I don't know, but it does mean that it becomes an international issue. It's not just that they storm in with guns and take over and that's it, end of story. No, that has international implications. Plus, of course, all the residents will draw upon their international connections, because it's a very, very cosmopolitan sort of idea. Okay, so, but I mean, does that mean that in every situation the buck stops at the state just coming in and taking over? I mean, that's the struggle, isn't it?
It is, and I'd say similarly as the geographically located to a single space cities are vulnerable to this kind of attacks from the outside authority, I would say that they might also be vulnerable internally, as in when ownership change place across generation, the founding agreements might become vulnerable or subject to change. And I'm speaking in as lay terms as they get, but to me, from the outside, it seems similar to the, I'd say, Bitcoin exchanges in the crypto space, where it's something that's a very useful tool, something that we really like using, but at the same time, there is the single point of failure where all the benefits could suddenly be lost.
Okay, what if you're using that analogy then, the Bitcoin and the exchange analogy? So the exchange is the city, right?
Yeah.
What's the Bitcoin in that analogy?
I would say the residents then.
Because I'm not the idea, the freedom. I mean, think about it. Like, you can shut the residents down. You can't. Bitcoin exists as a decentralized. I mean, it's very hard to put your finger on what it is. I mean, we know it's a way of transfer of value, but it's so many other things as well. But one thing it is very intangible, and people are real. People in a city are easy to put in jail, regulate, kick out.
I would say the analogy still works, but there are two different ways to look at it. So even when a Bitcoin exchange shuts down, the owner runs off with the money, the idea of Bitcoin still perseveres and it's still strong, but the particular Bitcoins at the exchange are lost to the users. Similarly, the idea of free private cities, if one collapses, still perseveres and it's still great, but the wealth of I wouldn't say the people, thanks to the international connections that you mentioned, would probably survive and thrive elsewhere or in the same place, but their wealth or some of them investment in their residence in the private city would also be lost.
Okay, I can agree with that, but then obviously my instant thought is, well, that's no reason to stop building a free city.
Of course it is not. Of course it is not. And that's what I said. It's one of the avenues that we have towards progress, and I'm excited that it resonates. But I would say that there is another alternative. So one of them is the free private cities and moving to the Gold's Gulch, and the second one is building parallel structures.
Sorry, the first one, moving to
the Gold's Gulch, or to the private cities. That was.
Sorry, I misunderstood that. So your two alternatives are.
Yeah, I would say that one of them is. So I'm generally pessimistic about how much we can change the system itself. That being said, I think the alternatives are either moving somewhere else, voting with one's feet, going to the private cities, but also to build the parallel structures and to continue to thrive where we are outside of the established institutions.
Sure. I'm in total agreement there, and I've often discussed this with a lot of people because I actually think it's a matter of personality types. Some people like to stay and fight. Because not fight, but even creating a parallel system, it takes effort. It takes effort to live alongside something that you're basically, for want of a better word, trying to ignore. Whereas moving with your feet to a group of people, that suits a different type of personality type. So are you the stay and have a parallel system type? Or are you a voter with your feet? Or maybe a bit of both?
I would say a bit of both, but more inclined to staying and engaging in some parallel infrastructure. But at the same time, first of all, I recognize that this approach has its limits, thanks to you still being in the physical location, having physical needs that are not sometimes in the scope of the parallel infrastructure. But also, on the other side, I'm optimistic about the system itself as it is in most places, because I'd say that we are still doing quite well. We are doing much better than we've been for most of our history.
Yeah.
And I like to talk about it because we just celebrated 8 billion people, which I think is great. Most of them are doing much better than they have ever been. So,
okay, yeah. I mean, I agree with that. Also, I wouldn't be sitting here if I was happy with the system, though.
Of course, that's why we are here, and we want to, as much as it can, we want the system to get better. But
so, tell me about your own ideology, then, or are you a libertarian, or what? Not whatever that means. I know there's there's a huge spectrum, but what is your? How could you explain to me what your sort of belief system is?
So I am a libertarian, and I believe in presenting the positive side of libertarianism. So I much rather talk about how great we are doing, how economic freedom brings us progress, and how social freedoms bring us more open and much more pleasant society, allowing us to engage in much more diverse spectrum of activities. And I think that has not only the strong utilitarian argument of everybody doing great, but it also has a very strong war story of allowing people to do what they want to do and living the good life.
So how do you rate our social freedom at the moment, then? Historically speaking, are we doing all right?
I would say, historically speaking, we might have the best social freedom we've ever had. I think that's one of the... I would say the economic freedom might be in the Western countries or the developed countries slightly on the decline, but I would say the social freedom is still on the increase. One of the cases in point would be the drug war that we are objectively winning in most places.
The drug war, as in
the criminalization of drug usage and sale somewhere. So I would say that that's slowly going away, and hopefully it will be done for soon.
As in the criminalization of drug usage. Yeah. Okay. Well, but I mean, it's probably, it runs against the grain of what a lot of people in this kind of world think, that we're heading in a direction of greater social freedom, say. Is your theory that doesn't really matter because if you zoom out far enough, the trajectory is that?
I think it matters to look at the local trends, not only at the centuries-long ones, because, of course, if there was a change in the trend going on, we would love to catch it at the time and do something about it. But I don't think that's happening. I think one thing that often gets discussed is not so much the legal aspect of it, but the cultural one, where the culture can be just as restrictive as the laws themselves or the regulations, as many tribal cultures can testify. But I would say that not even that is really happening, and I'm generally optimistic about where we are.
How do you feel about the state then, as in, well, everyone knows what we consider the state. How do you feel about that? Because there are very few examples around the world of places that exist without such an entity. You seem you're happy with the way things are progressing, but there isn't really an alternative to you can't opt out of the system currently, really. I mean, we're trying our hardest, but
you can't really. I think whenever we speak of stateless societies, we typically look way to the past, or I think it was Randall Holcomb who wrote that. When we typically look at the current places, it's usually places where, not surprisingly, not many people want to move. Mm-hmm. Like Somalia gets mentioned, and I don't really see many libertarians moving to Somalia, regardless of whether they discuss it as the anarchic society. So I would say people aren't seeking these alternatives because they are not attractive for other reasons. But I would say that the state as an entity is something that won't go away easily, and we need to function alongside it.
So what about then the idea that obviously with bringing it back to free cities, the prediction of the free cities model is the state can carry on to exist. What you're aiming for is the ability to opt out of the state. Mm-hmm. That's all it is. Mm-hmm. No one in a free city cares what everyone else is doing. They care that there is an option for them to opt out. Do you think that, I agree with you, the state's not going away, but are options arriving? Do you think, would you imagine that over the next 100 years there will be legitimate options?
I think there will be. And the more regulation there is piling up, the more attractive they will be. In one sense, the states might benefit these projects by trying to, by their reactions to them. But at the same time, I don't think that what's bring us to the ideal solution. There is a popular argument amongst some groups of libertarianism, the crisis theory, where the idea is that you need to have as big of a crisis as it gets, so that then after the crisis is over, the new ideal society is born, and it seems that doesn't really happen historically. There is
I'm struggling. I put it this way: I can think of many instances where that didn't happen.
Yeah,
there may well be. I mean, I'm looking at COVID immediately. I saw that whole lockdown scenario as pretty intense, and many people just went along with it. The majority by a long way. Same with a war. End of a war. You don't see libertarian uprisings when the war's over. You often see the opposite, in fact.
But at the same time, I would say, and this is going slightly off to the side, because we talked about authority, but I would say COVID in one way proves how great we are doing overall, because we managed to shut down for 2 years, and it set us back to 2019 global living standards, or from 2017, like 2 years back. So since the start, so we could afford to just sit home for 2 years and do nothing.
Yeah, yes. I mean, you wrote about this. One of the articles I found: 100 million people thrown into poverty from lockdowns,
which is of course terrible, and it hit the countries in the developing world much more than us here in Europe or in the US, because as our demand decreased, because we started saving instead of spending, because we couldn't go out, we were stuck in our homes, and the demand for what we could buy changed, because instead of buying goods, we just sat home and watched TV. So that hit the people who supply the Western world with goods the most, which is usually the people in the developing world. So in the places that aren't there yet were set back the most, which I think is the saddest part of it. And they often introduced much fewer restrictions because they were the ones who couldn't afford to sit at home for 2 years. So that, I think, is one of the tragedies of the pandemic. But at the same time, overall, I think it proves how well we are doing globally.
What about your opinion on the decision to, for example, lock down? Not a very libertarian idea in its essence.
It's not a very libertarian idea, especially in its execution. I can see, and that might be a good topic to discuss with somebody who runs a private cities. I actually don't know how the existing private cities reacted to the pandemic, but I can very much imagine a libertarian solution when, if necessary, a lockdown takes place, but people are compensated for the loss in income, for the loss in comfort, and for what they couldn't do. Where the compensation part is what didn't happen, because it frankly was unaffordable. And
but I would imagine, I mean, I don't know whether this is true, but theoretically, within the contract of the city would be, this will happen if this happens.
Yeah.
I presume. And
but you cannot contract for all possible alternatives.
I mean, but it would be written into contracts from now on, almost certainly, for sure. I mean, because that was a big thing. But
true, but different natural disasters may come that might require different interferences with people's freedom. I don't want to speak to the particular case of COVID because I'm no expert on that, but certainly we can imagine situations where interference of this kind is warranted, and then I think it comes down to how the government or the private city or whoever is the entity ruling that area faces the consequences of that.
Well, and presumably, if there are enough satellite cities, there will be the ones that don't lock down and the ones that do. I mean, theoretically.
And that would be a perfect natural experiment for economists to observe. But one more thing that I wanted to say is I'm a big fan of Robert Nozick, and I think his insights feed well into this, because he has the idea of the offensive compensation. When assuming that you compensate for your loss, you can interfere with somebody's rights as the person, policymaker, who needs to make that decision. And I think that's a very elegant way of checking on the power, because if that's something that actually is possible to do and enforce, which is questionable, but if it is, then that becomes the check on what severity of restrictions is possible, because the government cannot restrict something that they cannot afford to compensate.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, except in this day and age, I mean, wouldn't that require some kind of like hard money standard? Because the government can. I mean, the government did in the UK at least did compensate people immensely with and the result probably, I would imagine, was inflation. I don't, I'm not. That's my interpretation of it. It's not very. There's probably a much deeper level than this. But in the UK, they locked everyone down and paid them to stay at home, myself included. And it was quite a large sum of money we were receiving. If you run a business, you were getting 80% of your normal income to stay at home. And it was rather surprising. I don't know what happened in the Czech Republic, but
something very similar.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. But I would say that there is, again, a limit on that. It's not the limit that we would like to see, but there is always the limit of sovereign default that sort of caps the government at some level of public debt, and I think that still functions. So I would say that the very popular among some libertarians argument that the government can just print themselves out of any such issues, I don't think that's valid at least in the Western world with independent central banks.
I once again, I'm speaking from a relatively simple understanding of this, but is the demand of the demand on your currency, the level of the demand for your currency is the reflection of how much you can print your way out of a situation like that. For example, the US dollar has huge demand around the world. So you can really currently still print as much of it as you want. It doesn't make any difference. There's always a demand for it. It doesn't cause a hugely inflationary event. Although, it depends what you mean by that, I suppose. We're running at, 10% inflation at the moment, I think.
Yeah, it depends on where you are. I think it's slightly more here.
Yeah, and that's the inflation calculated from the basket of goods, which is a very bad way of judging inflation, because I know for a fact the price of my house went up 30% in that time. So, and that's not in the basket of goods.
Yeah, you mentioned whether the demand for the currency can influence how much you can spend, how much you can print, and definitely that's definitely a part of that equation. But I would say institutionally now, at least in most places, it's not possible to directly deficit finance government spending. So there is that institutional check as well. And it's true that especially in the pandemic, most of the countries inflated a lot, but the government subsidies to the people who stayed at home weren't the only part of that. One additional part of that was people's own decisions, and they changed consumer behavior, right? When they instead started saving and putting money to their bank accounts, especially if they could still earn from home or from receiving the handouts that they couldn't spend because there was nowhere to spend them. So that was additional reason that contributed to that. So it wasn't just the inflation we are dealing with now isn't it is indirectly government induced through the restrictions as well, but not only through monetary policy channels.
Do you believe in monetary policy, or do you believe in the ultimate free market, or somewhere sort of in between?
I would say one cannot not believe in monetary policy. It is a thing that exists. It is a thing that has some effects. We can debate whether it has the intended effects or whether it has the intended effects all or most of the time. But I would say I definitely believe that it can work in some situations. And I would say it's not the ideal way of managing money. So, of course, I would ideally like to see the money out of the government's hands. And regardless whether it is some Hayekian token of basket of goods managed by a private bank or Bitcoin, which, of course, is great. But yeah, let's have private money.
How about the gold standard? Are you a fan?
I am. I mean, if that was the only alternative, I guess I would be a fan, but I think we have better options now.
i.e. Bitcoin or something else?
Bitcoin, for example, or some of the experiments in the hiking direction, but they are not very resilient, so maybe that might be on.
I don't know anything about those. What are they? Talk about some of the experiments in non-state currency then, or non.
Well, the idea is that there would be a privately managed currency that, unlike Bitcoin, would be price stabilizing. So it would be slightly inflationary. At least that's what assumed, because naturally we observe deflation, right, when the economy is growing. So in order to have a price stabilizing currency, it would have to be slightly inflationary.
Why do you say that the economy is naturally deflationary? Is that because technology is making everything cheaper?
Yeah, because if we are making improvements in productivity and technology, then when there is economic growth in general, then we would naturally see deflation, I think.
Right. So, and the idea of those currencies would be to stabilize price. So you would give, if we were retracting at 2%, you'd want to, due to technology, you'd want to inflate it at 2%.
They wouldn't necessarily have to, but the argument is that that's what people would prefer to spend. Because if we have a currency that's also deflationary, that means that if you hold it, it raises in value. So essentially, it would be an interest-bearing currency. So if you have something like that, you would prefer to keep it and spend something that's, not interest-bearing. So
true, but people still need to spend money. Or like, I've got a brand new Android phone, and I didn't sit here and think, well, I've got some, I'm not going to buy my phone because I know in 2 years' time that phone's going to be 20% cheaper. I still want to buy the phone.
Because the phone has, that's true. The phone has use value for you, and that's right. But you have, if in the space where you are faced with alternatives, you have both the price stabilizing currency and the hard currency on your account. Which one would you spend for the phone, assuming somebody accepts it?
Well, it would also depend on, it wouldn't just be on, I wouldn't be making a calculation based on money, on value as much as a lot of people think. If my next door neighbor said, I was bung us some Bitcoin, I'd pay him in Bitcoin, but I understand where you're going with that. What about though? Go on.
One more. There is actually a way that these two could work together. So the idea that the currencies wouldn't be fiat currencies, the Hayekian model. The idea is that there is a basket of goods. In Hayek's idea, it was raw materials, and that would be the check on the value of the currency. So the bank would manage a portfolio of these goods, and they would essentially be. It would, in some way, would be a basket of commodity that would back the money. So rather than money convertible just for gold, this would be a basket, and the basket would change so that it stabilizes the price of the currency, and there is no way why, or there is no reason why one of the things in the basket couldn't be a hard currency.
Okay, so my alarm bells went off when you said privately managed currency. Obviously, that explain to me why a privately managed currency would be any different to a state managed currency or a state.
Well, I think the incentives are different for the state and for a bank managing its own currency, and I think first of all, the state is subject to political goals, especially when the independence of the monetary authority is lower. And secondly, the state inherently benefits from having not commodity-based fiat money, and that's what I think libertarians agree is not the best way to manage money. And we can fight over whether the ideal way is Bitcoin, gold, or whatever else. But I think we all agree that fiat money is not it.
Currently, well, I mean, it's obviously served a purpose, and it evolved naturally. It makes, when you look at the history of fiat money, it's very obvious why it evolved. The tokenization of an asset that gold needed to be tokenized, because you can't carry large sums of gold around you, and then the incentives then led it to the place we are now, where you can just print pieces of paper and get hard goods for them. The other thing I thought about with the privately managed currency is, how do you get one of those things started? Like, how do you start a privately managed currency? Because number one, you have to have the authority of the state, presumably, because currently they're the big boss who do it. This is what the wonderful thing about Bitcoin was. It grew out of nothing. It just appeared, and people opted into it. But no one's going to opt into a privately managed currency. Otherwise, well, A, it disenfranchises the state, and B, who's going to trust a privately managed currency?
Yeah, and it has the same issue that we discussed earlier when with the private cities or the Bitcoin exchanges, that there is a single point of failure, right? So there has been some experiments with eGold and different other projects, and the obvious weakness there is that the state can come in when it becomes too successful and just confiscate all the reserves or the servers or whatever it is that it's running on.
Which they did.
They
literally did.
And that's why Bitcoin is so great, because it was resilient to this. Another alternative was, and it showed, it was one of the most interesting experience in this area, I think, was that even very large, maybe one of the largest international corporations, were not strong enough to get something like that off the ground. And I'm speaking of Facebook's Libra, which in a way was a Hayekian experiment. It wasn't raw materials, but there was a basket of currencies that were supposed to balance out the price level of the Libra token, and it sounded very interesting. But
what do you think went on there at Libra? Do you think they literally? Because what I found fascinating about that was that they actually decided to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because, that's obviously under the proviso that what actually happened was that a guy in a black suit came around to, the Facebook offices and said, "Look, you've got to shut this down. Like, we run the money here." I don't know. Do you know whether that actually happened? Or
I'm not sure. But I can imagine investors generally in what's now Meta would be worried when this was a threat to the company's other endeavors. But I also think that, or I'm interested in what would have happened if it wasn't national currencies what was supposed to be in the basket, because then the states are inherently threatened when a large corporation that has 3 billion users worldwide, maybe less, maybe more, suddenly starts deploying currency that uses major currencies as backing in its basket. Because then if Facebook didn't like something that the US government did, for example, they could just say, okay, we are phasing the US dollar out of the basket, and essentially with that large user base manipulate the price of the US dollar. So
that's the question. Why didn't they just go ahead? Because they obviously, well, who knows? Maybe it's because the state has a huge violent power behind it. It's the one thing. Facebook has more it's the biggest nation in the world, probably, amongst I don't know who. They're probably, it maybe is one of the biggest. So it has access to many more people than any state could ever dream of. And they went for it. They said, we're issuing our currency, like our token and stuff. But then, when it all stopped, it must have been somebody from the powers that be saying, no, we do this.
But there were some congressional hearings about that as well. And they've been questioning whether they actually have the right to issue what essentially would be a currency.
Do you know what the result of that was? I mean, as far as I know, you're not allowed to issue a currency, are you?
Yeah, you are. But the question is, then what other tokens that people use in the online space are a currency and which ones are not?
Yeah.
But because, you pay with other online tokens somewhere. If you have a coupon, I don't know, what do you call these cards that you collect stamps for in restaurants?
Yeah.
Does that become a currency? So
anything can become a currency.
Exactly.
We know that, yeah.
So that begs a lot of questions. And one maybe more prosaic reasons could be that Facebook just calculated how many people are likely to adopt it and calculated the costs of dealing with all the legal issues and decided that it's not worth it.
Interesting. I remember when it happened, my initial instant thought when I looked at it was Facebook is becoming a financial institution, which would have been a really shrewd move, I think. Not that they were already a super powerful company, obviously, but having their own token would have made them absolutely. It would have been a good business decision, I would have imagined, but.
And it might have been emulating the WeChat model from China that essentially also serves as ways of transacting.
Yeah.
But that's of course controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So
sure, but which I say, go back to my original point. Someone came in from the government and said, "You're not doing this because we wanted. This is what we do." But it's true. I agree. Like WeChat is, and then going back to what you said earlier about you're optimistic about the future. It's things like WeChat that make me very pessimistic about the future. And because this is a scaling of a technological innovation that has horrendous effects on personal liberty, as far as I can tell, and it is actually they are showing now. You can see it in China, where, or you could see it. I mean, in another sense, in Canada, with bank accounts get switched off for political reasons relatively easily now, by the looks of it. But with WeChat, it's even more insidious because it's centralized more. I mean, at least the Canadian government had to go to the bank and say, "Can you shut this account down?" WeChat don't.
Yeah.
They already have the button, you know, and obviously the state iteration of this is the central bank digital currency. And my take on, you know, Facebook and Libra is the state knew it wanted a CBDC, and it didn't want a competitor, because that's what it would have been. It was a central corporation digital currency, rather. You know, same idea though, presumably.
I think there is actually a Chinese digital currency now in development, or actually in some advanced stage of large scale testing.
Yes.
I think I've heard something like
Yes,
it's being tested on like
so
200 million people, or something like that, something incredible. So I think China is moving in that direction. The benefit of that, of course, is that it's much easier to push internationally than just normal Chinese currency.
But correct me if I'm wrong, but WeChat, what are you transacting with on WeChat then, according to you? If you're paying with on that network, what are you using?
I actually don't have that knowledge, but I would assume you use the normal currency.
Yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah.
I mean, so it'd be interesting to see if what you say is correct. I should talk to Peter Young about this. He's a China aficionado, but because I know that WeChat is absolutely ubiquitous throughout, you know, as a payment method. If the central bank digital currency is coming in, it would either have to pervade that network. That would make sense to just use that network. Yeah. But as far as I know, they're paying with yuan with WeChat. It's just that's the network and the rails under which the transactions flow.
Yeah, which probably wouldn't be that difficult to make the switch in China.
Sure.
Which comes back again to the optimistic view about our institutional framework, because our institutions have been around for so long and are so rigid that getting something like that through would be so difficult. And there is so much unwillingness to do anything on many levels. Yes, I think that's very much the Prime Minister world that we are living in.
They are being tested though. CBDCs are being tested all over the place in Europe as well.
Right, but I don't think they are very viable, and I don't actually consider them a real threat. I mean, the Chinese one is definitely the closest one to it, but I don't really think we are going to see a real CBDC.
Explain why not? Is that a technological reason, or is it
I think it's resource reason. So first of all, most of the governments are in the stage of talking about it. I think Fed actually decided not to proceed with further testing, but even after they do decide to do that, it will be years or decades before they have something operational. And even after that, there are basically two ways that they can go. First of all is that they directly issue the CBDCs, and they say, okay, now all of you citizens have accounts at the central bank, and then yes, that's the most liberty threatening model, where the central bank can issue currency when it wants to boost inflation directly to people's account, or erase some part of its currency, has direct control over everybody's finances. But the central bank doesn't have resources so that, because imagine all the infrastructure built around commercial banking, and all that would have to be managed by the central bank. The resources for that are not in place. They don't exist. The infrastructure for the local branches that people would need who won't be able to manage it online doesn't exist. And then the second option is that the central bank digital currencies wouldn't actually be that central bank, and they would push them on commercial banks, meaning that the central bank would say to commercial banks, okay, alongside the dollar or the Czech crown or the pound, you now also need to have accounts in the UK digital currency, and you operate these two accounts, and there needs to be some exchange rate between the state currency and the digital currency, and then it very much depends on popular demand whether people would adopt it. And I'm not sure, unless there are free handouts in the currency, I don't see many reasons to do that.
Well, I'm misunderstanding you here. I think the CBDC would be issued by the central bank, but on the command of the state, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's
sense that at the moment, the state doesn't produce money; it produces bonds, and the state, and the central banks are just the issuers of.
So that's the threat of the central bank digital currency, is that it sort of mixes the fiscal and monetary policy, and the central bank essentially just becomes the infrastructure for the government policy for it. But that's the model I don't see happening because of the resource constraints.
That doesn't mean, though, that there won't be. I mean, resources are movable at all times, and over a period of 10 years, who knows what infrastructure could spring up. Plus, I would posit that the technology required to issue a CBDC is very scalable, and the bureaucracy is not huge. It's very the technology advancements is making it a hell of a lot easier to just issue an app. Say, people have already got phones, everyone's there. Issue an app. State issues a mandate that says, right, on this date we're switching over to the CBDC. Here's your digital wallet issued by the the European Central Bank, or whoever you are, and you've got to do it. And at this point, all old dollars will become worthless, or all old pounds become worthless. Isn't that how it would work? You don't think so? You think too much bureaucracy there?
I think the physical infrastructure is bigger obstacle than the bureaucracy. And of course, then you need to deal with, being the government in mostly democratic country, then you need to deal with all the commercial banks that would then, they wouldn't have anything to do if all people had mandatory checking accounts with the central bank directly. So that would be replacing an entire economic sector with the government, essentially. I wouldn't call it nationalization. It would be replacement, but I don't really think that's something that's viable.
I did 2 interviews recently in Honduras with the 2 guys setting up Sechat Bank, which is a bank in a free city. They both told me CBDCs are coming. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that?
I'm skeptical to that.
Really?
Or maybe I'm optimistic in that I don't think that they are coming.
Well, me too. I hope they don't come. I think fortunately, I think at least Bitcoin exists, which I put them on polar opposite ends of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. They are, and so in a way, I know that there is an option. How that manifests, though, if they do, whether or not, I mean, you would posit that an alternative, the circular economy exists, like a black market economy. Bitcoin's the black market economy, and then you've got the central bank digital currency. The question is, how many people would use the Bitcoin economy? I know a lot of libertarians would never, but even then, going back to your parallel structures thing, it's fine if you live in a private city somewhere and everyone's transacting in Bitcoin, but if you live in Prague and no one accepts Bitcoin, you've got a problem. Plus, and if they stop on-ramps between Bitcoin and CBDCs, let's say, that's also a problem. But you don't even think CBDCs are going to exist.
I don't think they will in near future, at least.
What do you think about this idea then that the world will polarize in the coming years between the Chinese model of central digital currency and the slightly more freedom-orientated model of the Bitcoin circular economy? Mm-hmm. For those reasons that you mentioned, maybe the world may polarize into the very centralized and the tending towards the centralized and the tending towards the decentralized.
Mm-hmm. So I do think that this polarization is likely both geopolitically and internally. So as you mentioned, if it doesn't have to be CBDCs. It can just be increasing monitoring of internet traffic and so on, which is ongoing, or generally privacy breaches. Then that might create larger groups of people who want to be separated from the system, people who use Tor, who use Bitcoin, and these two groups, they might eventually turn out to be a larger group of people who try to exist outside the system and larger group of people who exist within it. But coming back to the question, I do think that's likely. I've recently spoken to somebody who has professional interest in the development of the Chinese digital currency, and his take on that was the way China is going to deploy it is through its trade connection in Africa and South America and other places. So as part of its international investments, it will insist on making them in its own digital currency, and that's how it's going to spread it and try to make it a competitor to the dollar. So that was his take, which I think is might be right.
Okay, then what about the theory that I was debating at breakfast with somebody else, that people in the end will always choose the hardest money?
Right. They will for holding the money, definitely. But for daily spending, that's a question. Many people who use or have Bitcoin don't use it in daily transactions. And it might be the same that we all just become holders of hard money, but spenders of whatever we have.
Or using it as a savings technology, maybe.
Yeah, that's the better option.
Well, an interesting evolution within the Bitcoin. I'm in the Bitcoin space. Have been for a while, and what I've noticed in the last year is the hodl meme. You know what the hodl meme is? Basically, keep your Bitcoin. Is morphing into spend and replace, and I've seen the first now wave of people advocating for spend and replace, because I agree, holding Bitcoin is a good idea for you over the long term, no question about that, but it doesn't solve the problem of day-to-day transactions, and it's a real thing that people who hold Bitcoin don't like to spend Bitcoin because they, it's a bet on the future currently as much as anything else, So yeah, I see now on Twitter and social media in various places that, spend and replace, especially like when I've been going to El Salvador a lot, and people in the beginning a year ago everyone was spending Bitcoin, and then I went back a few months ago and there was much less of it, but there was this new understanding. Look, spend and replace. If you really want to get this thing going, you have to spend Bitcoin. And if it bothers you that your amount of Bitcoin is going down, just buy some more and replace it. But do spend. Most people that spend Bitcoin are in the luxurious position probably of even having it, because it's not something that everyone has. Mainly because they're spending all their money on other things. It's savings are something that most people don't get to have anymore. Yeah, I'm pleased to hear though that you don't think CBDCs are going to make it, because that is a very pervasive idea. The idea that they're coming is a matter of time, and but you think really as a function of the Western system, it's highly unlikely. Why is it going to work in China then? How is it going to be? How come it's going to happen in China, like you say?
I think it's likely because of the centralization of the overall system, of their ability to push this on people, and through that, if they are able to push it on the companies, that means that they can get the infrastructure that they need for it.
So, okay, well, maybe then the competitive urge of everyone that isn't China, like look at the big conglomerations around the world, Europe, America, North America, South America. If China gets it in place and then exports it to the rest of the world via trade with, say, Africa, that's a massive threat, because that's basically China making a play for the reserve currency of the world, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there's going to be a response to that. It's certainly by the US dollar, because they don't want to lose status of. So wouldn't their response be to create their own version of a CBDC, and it under emergency powers, maybe, because it's like China are attacking,
I think, and it's definitely something that I don't want to predict, but it's something that might happen as a political move, but I don't think it's a likely successful move. I think ultimately what people in out of the US hold dollar for is that it's historically stronger than their own currencies, and strong dollar will always be the best argument for dollar, I think, anywhere.
And according to you, of course, the CBD requires a very authoritarian regime to implement it, and
it does.
As long as that doesn't exist in the free world, for want of a better word, then it's not going to happen.
Or alternatively, it requires the sort of commercial banks run CBDC, which isn't that different from what we have now. So that doesn't really change much.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. Can we go briefly back to free cities?
Of course.
Because when we spoke at the start, you said, you've got a lot of ideas you've got a lot of anti-free cities ideas. Well, not anti, that's wrong. A few points to sort of mention and I'd really like to hear some more. I know you had some good ones earlier. What else are your detractions from the notion and from the idea of the free city?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's again the single point of failure. So both from the outside threats and the internal ones when generations change, mismanagement occurs, and people are essentially locked in by their investment in the city. So that's one of the threats I see, and that doesn't mean I don't like the idea. So I didn't mean to come across as pessimistic generally. I just see it as a great experiment that has great advantages and also disadvantages. And I think the disadvantages, well, both the benefits in comparison to staying where we are will increase as economic regulation intensifies, but with that will also increase the incentives of the states to limit trade and impose other restrictions, which will mostly be tax related to sort of regulate them out of, or try to regulate them out of existence. We will see how successful in that they will be.
Do you have a preferred governance model yourself? How would you? Dream. What? Present to me your utopian future.
I would say my utopian future is stateless, and of course the natural question is whether that isn't just a multitude of private cities, which is very well possible. So it might be that private cities are a way towards that, and we will just see if more of them pop out, and if the governments oversleep that, maybe that's the way.
So what else can exist in a stateless world then?
I would say there can be and again, this is something that I can't really, and I don't really like to predict, because the go-to answer by libertarians is, the market will come up with something that we can't even imagine now. But I can imagine some businesses competing in the same geographical area about different functions that we currently associate with the state. So some part of it might be infrastructure, be it plumage and roads and electricity network and so on, and various other services such as safety, order, and so on, healthcare. So I would say that maybe this can be even more decentralized than the private city, because this model eventually would be private, but not really, but more dispersed over a large geographical area. But that's again me daydreaming, and we can't really know what would come if it ever comes.
Well, nothing wrong with that. I mean, when I think of a free city model, I'm not massively enamored about the city side of it. Not that it is. The model isn't necessarily in like high-rise buildings.
I understand that, yeah.
But I would much rather live out in the middle of the countryside like I do now. I live in the middle of the countryside. I think the theory still stands, though, that it's a jurisdiction that you opt into. And like you, I don't know how it plays out, but I don't have a better idea. I mean, I like that notion. I would... Theoretically, I would say, yeah, stateless is the way to go, but I don't know what that looks like, and I can't think enough about it to decide. Yes, this would create this amazing utopia, because I must say though, letting it evolve naturally does seem like the best option, and that currently isn't happening. We know that that's not happening because we know there's no opting out of this particular way.
Yeah, because there is no space. If there are more cities to pop out, there is no space where they would pop out. So the only way they are possible, I assume, is through agreements with the local government, which already places some limitations and potential future threats or restrictions.
Yeah, no, true. Plenty of space on the earth, just not much jurisdictional space, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've already been talking for an hour and a half, and I'm cognizant of time here, so I better wrap this up. But I've got a final question to ask you, which is a question we ask everyone on this pod, and it is to imagine that you have a 1-year sabbatical. You get to leave your current life for a year with all expenses paid and money at your disposal if you want to work on something, or even just to go skiing for a year. It's up to you. What would you use that time to do, that 1 year?
I actually think if we are talking about how to use this time to approach the libertarian idea better, I actually think what I am currently mostly involved in doing is what makes the most sense, and that's working with students. I'm with the Students for Liberty, and I think they will eventually be the one who will be leading this fight to bring about, whether it is private cities or whether it is other projects, whether they will create the new Bitcoin or create a new innovation on top of Bitcoin, like Lightning Network was, or continue the struggle in any other area. So I would say that the resources invested in them are the best spent resources, because they, and not only they, but the people they talk to and the people that they get to influence are the people who will be shaping the world we also live in. And I think that that's eventually how we win. I think we do need the minor innovation. We do need the big innovation, but eventually what we need is just the numbers and the popular demand for these solutions. And that's possible to generate through this, I think.
Can I ask you a quick question about Students for Liberty? In your opinion, has the political landscape within the student realm changed much over the last period of time? And are libertarian ideas, are those kind of that section of the spectrum, are they cool? Are they like thought about? Because the impression I get, but bearing in mind, I'm not a student and I haven't been for a long time, but I get the idea that socialism's cool again, and like everyone wants to be a lefty now.
So So you are now in Central/Eastern Europe. So the situation is very different here.
Okay.
We don't really get the young socialist and not at all the young communist. That's still something that's a bad label.
Really?
Yeah.
So what's your average Eastern European student into then?
I would say he might be moderate liberal. Not classical liberal, but moderate liberal, I would say, would be the predominant student type. Very often much more classically liberal economically than I would say the average Western student. But I would say generally it depends very much, as it does with Central and Eastern Europe, it depends very much on where you are and the students of what field you are talking to as well, because students of economics or computer science tend to be very different from students of medicine, for example. So I would say that the student interest in this area is very different. In some countries that we have students in, they lean more progressive. In some countries they lean more conservative. But overall, we primarily deal with the selection of students that classify as libertarians, and I would say that the ideas definitely resonate, especially with young people who are open to be radical and who are seeking the ideas that they would identify with and that they see as the one that lead to the best future, because they are the ones who care about it the most.
And is it growing?
It is. At least in Europe, where I have the information about, but I think globally as well. That doesn't necessarily reflect on the libertarian movement as a whole, right? Because we only deal with students and we only grow when our students are the ones who are making people excited about the ideas. But when they talk to further students. But my impression is that the libertarian movement as a whole is becoming more visible. Of course, both of us are probably in a bubble that we view this through, but I would say that we are more visible, and what's even more important, even if we are not, our solutions are becoming more visible. Libertarians been talking about how, and I'm coming back to war on drugs, but that's not the only topic. We've been talking about minority rights, we've been talking about rights of people with different sexual orientation, for example, for decades, and that's something that we now see being implemented. Recent US presidency again reminded everybody that trade controls is not a great idea, as did the discussion around Brexit, for example. So I would say that even if we as libertarians are not necessarily visible, what matters is that the ideas are.
You studied in England, right? In Edinburgh?
Yeah,
right?
I did.
Did you notice a different political slant there when you were there compared to here then?
I did. I was there during the election, and I was studying economics there, and I was very surprised how many of the students were voting Labour, because that's something that you don't really encounter many left-leaning economics students here in my experience, or strongly left-leaning economics students here. And so this was definitely interesting, but at the same time, I would say the students were not... I don't think I encountered anybody who would be closed off to the ideas either. So there were people who had different opinions and they were willing to discuss them, whether it was monetary policy, because we are all economists, or whether it was inequality and other issues, or whether it was social issues where they were very open and very much on board with most of our ideas. So I wouldn't say that the situation was worse, it was just different.
Yeah, so I'm clutching at pearls, as we say, thinking that universities are getting overrun by communists. Is that right? That it's not real.
I think maybe, and I have just my own personal experience with that. I don't have any broader view on that. But I would say, even if in economic terms this might be the case that students, especially in the West, are increasing left-leaning, and possibly here, I guess the trend is spreading. But I would say that we still shouldn't cut ourselves off from that discussion, and we should be part of it, and we should talk about the issues that we agree on, the social issues, and then we will see if we can, once we get into that discussion, then we can see if we can continue discussion with these students about the other topics as well.
Bravo to that. That's a very diplomatic way of being. I wish everyone was that diplomatic. Jan, thank you very much for coming and talking. It's been a great conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed the CBDC bit. It's one of my pet interests.
Okay,
and
thank you.
I'm happy to hear you've got a different opinion to me, which is great. So good luck with everything, and thanks for coming.
Yeah. Thank you as well. Thank you for having me, and good luck to Private Cities.